This is the 200th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. It was a significant battle. Professor Ron Chapman is at the Nunez Community College in Chalmette. He has graciously come to give us a presentation. I know you're going to enjoy it. Very exciting. Professor Dr. Ron Chapman. He does have the book. It will be for sale at the back table. Thank you.
I know it's that the battle was fought, if the treaty was signed, so it had no meaning whatsoever. It's not true. The treaty was initialed and signed by the individuals who were negotiating it, but it hadn't been signed by the king, hadn't been signed by the president, hadn't been ratified by Congress, nor had the documents been transferred, which is all part of the ratification process. Secondly, within the Treaty of Ghent, it says all property will be returned to their rightful owners. Well, the Americans had no problem with that. But the British never accepted the Louisiana Purchase. The British never accepted it, so if they had taken New Orleans, they had every intention of keeping it and returning it to Spain. Imagine what the impact would have been on the United States' western expansion. We certainly wouldn't have had the money to repurchase it. So there's an issue. And there's also, I understand, a letter with the Earl of Bathurst informing Pakenham on the way over here that if you hear about a treaty relating to New Orleans, disregard that information and press forward. So that's the number one thing. The second issue is a tendency to view the Battle of New Orleans as the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th. You've heard the songs with the cannonballs and the alligators' heads and all this sort of stuff. And sadly, even here in New Orleans and Louisiana, there's a focus on January 8th. It's a campaign for the South, and it begins early on. Now, the Peninsula Campaign ends in Europe in 1814, April, I believe. And pretty soon after that, the British are aggressively working along the Gulf Coast, supplying ammunition, clothing, weapons, training, advisors, I think we call them today, to the Indians, and also trying to reach out to the slaves to develop a slave rebellion. All of this is part of this activity along the Gulf there. They're aggressively doing this as they're working their way towards taking the city of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans had millions of dollars worth of goods because the city had been blockaded, so all the goods coming through the Mississippi waterways were just accumulating in the city. They arrived, the Brits arrived with empty cargo ships. They arrived with all the people necessary to operate a government. So they planned not only just taking it militarily, but occupying it. So the Battle of New Orleans, though, when we get started in the actual conflict, it goes on for quite a while. It begins with these first transfers of goods to the Native Americans. Following that, the first real conflict you're going to have is Fort Borgne. Now, a lot of people don't realize that there weren't 13 American colonies. There were 14. West Florida, at one time, was a British colony, from the French and Indian War to the end of the American Revolution. A lot of British loyalists had moved into that area. So when the British came in along the Gulf Coast, the first intent was to take Fort Borgne, which is at the mouth of Mobile Bay. It's presently Fort Morgan. It's actually a little runway there that I used to fly into as a kid to show you how stupid I was. Looking back at it, I thought, a little bitty runway. But anyway, they took that, the point was to take Fort Borgne. From there, go inland, take Mobile, and the entire British Army march across what was a British colony, shut off the Mississippi River, come down river and take the city of New Orleans. Had they accomplished that, they would have won, because Jackson wasn't there. There was nothing really in defensive taking place in New Orleans at that time. It's interesting, and you read the records, because William Percy was the commander of the invasion there, or the attack, and he writes this letter to Cochrane saying that this is basically going to be a cakewalk. It's no issue whatsoever. And then he loses his ship and gets defeated, and so you have this great letter I was reading where he's writing to Cochrane explaining how this mishap occurred. So as a result, it upset their entire timetable and snatched really victory, from the jaws, defeat from the jaws of victory. They really flipped it around on that one. So following that, now you have another battles taking place because Jackson had set up the defenses of Mobile. So after that, he decides he's going to bring the battle to the Spanish themselves because they're allowing the British to operate out of Pensacola. So he invades Pensacola. The British evacuate, blow up the forts, they move off. So you have two battles taking place early on. The British then organize themselves and start working their way back westward along the islands until they set up their encampment off of Ship Island, along the Chandelier Islands, and that's when you have Sam's favorite area, the Battle of Lake Borgne, which was a major battle. The Americans lose it. But what's important about the Battle of Lake Borgne is time. Jackson, if you look at the situation with time, it's absolutely critical. He doesn't get 2,500 Tennesseans and Kentuckians to 2 days before the Battle of the 8th. So if anything had happened prior to that, he wouldn't have been prepared on any level. So this Battle of Lake Borgne is critical, because even though it was over with Sam Kirk in just a few hours, I imagine, it took him almost 2 weeks to train the crews of the 43 barges on how to fire carronades off the front of the ships, how to organize themselves, how to put Marines on the ships and work on the ship-to-ship battle in very shallow water on 43 different barges. That delay played very well into the hands. Then the next battle you have is the British work their way up Bayou Avenue and settle themselves at the Villeray Plantation. Of course, I have some issues on that. Because Jackson, when he arrives on the 1st, and the first thing he does is look around and realize how pitiful the situation is for defense. So he declares martial law, musters as many people as he possibly can together, and orders all the waterways closed. The reason he does that is because the British early on had contacted Jean Lafitte and tried to get him to cooperate with them. He didn't. He passed the information off to both Claiborne and then Jackson. And because of that, they believe that there's definitely a threat on the waterways. Why would you go to a pirate unless you're trying to find a back way into the city? So that's why he ordered all the waterways closed. Bayou Avenue wasn't closed. So the question in my mind remains, why? And who ordered it left open? That's a question for which I have yet to find an answer. But it's critical, because the British come up Bayou Avenue secretly and plant themselves on the 23rd, the morning of the 23rd, at the Villeray Plantation, 7 miles below the city of New Orleans. Once they get there, they capture Villeray, who's sitting at his plantation, sitting with his feet on a rail, smoking a cigar and cleaning a fowling piece when the British surround him. And in this ultimate genius, he decides, maybe I should, and they're coming from behind him, so he runs in the house to try to get out the back door, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Colonel Thornton is waiting for him. He's the guy on the British side that I have the most incredible respect for. He's an amazing man. So anyway, once he's there, he escapes from the British. He works his way to Jackson, informs Jackson that the British are at his plantation. The genius here is that Jackson immediately attacks. It's December 23rd. He calls a night attack. British aren't used to fighting at night. That's not according to the game. That's not according to the rules. But you remember, these people aren't New Englanders. These are Westerners. These people have been fighting Indians all their lives. This is Duck Dynasty, okay? If you think about it, there are no rules. So Jackson attacks them in the middle of the night. He orders, the Carolina to float down across from their camp, sit there quietly and wait, and at 7:30 open up at broadsides into the British camp. He then comes down the river road himself with a detachment coming along the edge of the swamp under the command of both Delarond, whose home was down that way, and they attack him. It only lasts about 2 hours or so. The fog sets in. It's very cold. It's miserable conditions. British reinforcements start arriving on the field. Jackson pulls back. So this is your second battle. So even though the British will claim it a victory because they rode Jackson off, from the American perspective, it was a success because it demonstrated that they weren't going to run away.
This was December 23rd?
This is December 23rd, the night of December 23rd. Pakenham, all this way, is still trying to make it to the battlefield. He's not there yet. He arrives on December 25th, and he's in a bit of a panic because he's so much afraid that by the time he gets to New Orleans, he'll be in time to share dinner with Cochrane downtown. Maybe Antoine's if it was there. But anyway, that's what his fear is. But when he arrives, he finds the British haven't moved any forward. So he turns to one of the young soldiers he saw and asks him, "What's the problem?" And the man says, "Bullets. Bullets, that's all." So what he does is, he first of all deals with the Carolina, which is still attacking it with hot shot, blows it up. So by which case now the Americans only have one vessel in the river, the Louisiana, which they pull away to get away from being similarly sunk. Pakenham, after doing that, organizes his position, and he realizes that he's stuck where he's got a river on one side and a swamp on the other, the defensive line in front of him. Not a very comfortable situation, I'm sure, for any commander, because it restricts his options. Nevertheless, they still have the idea that the Americans may run and break. We don't know how strong they are. The militias have always done that. So on the 28th, he organizes a reconnaissance in force. The idea to probe the American lines. If they're weak, move forward. If they're not, pull back. He probes them. Americans are a little bit more resilient than he thinks. He pulls back. And when he pulls back, this is the second opportunity the British have for winning, because Gibbs comes up to him, General Gibbs, and says, "Why did you call us back?" He said, "Well, because we weren't going anywhere." He says, "Well, maybe you weren't, but I was in the swamp and I was just about behind Jackson's line. Given another 20 to 30 minutes, I would have rounded it. It would have been on both sides." There's another opportunity that's lost, but how could you possibly communicate that? The man's in behind a cypress swamp. This is a second opportunity. Pakenham then decides he's going to go to traditional artillery duels. So on January 1st, he had dragged, now if you have to remember, the British lines, supply lines, are nearly 90 miles long. They're rowing everything from the fleet by Ship Island through Lake Borgne up to the mouth of Bayou Bienvenue, floating up Bayou Bienvenue, then dragging the cannons to the front in very wet, soggy ground. So these men are exhausted. The naval men are amazing, the British naval men, what they did. The sailors' shoulders must have been like this by the time it was over with, because all they did was row back and forth these tremendous distances. So he organizes an artillery assault, and it fails, simply because Jackson is outnumbered, but he's using artillery guns where they've brought up naval cannons. Naval cannons don't work well in wet soil. They tend to sink back and fall on the ground. You can't get your windage, you can't get your elevation. So in relatively short order, they lose their cannon's ability. They also haven't brought enough ammunition to the front. So Pakenham has to call it off and pull back a second time. Of course, Jackson's men are thrilled. They've now faced them twice and held their ground. This is another opportunity that's lost because it was a very foggy, foggy day. It's January 1st. The Americans were literally partying in their lines, as we do, dancing, laughing, having a good time. Who's going to do anything on the 1st? So a lot of the junior officers said that had they not waited for the fog to clear and open up an artillery barrage, but had just quietly snuck up to the American lines, they could have taken them. And they likely would have, because it took Jackson a better part of 15 minutes to get the panic out of his men, get his guns organized, and begin his defense to protect himself. So now we come up to January 8th, the big battle. And on this one, Pakenham has really thought it out. And in looking at the situation, he says, well, all right, I mean, I've tried to go through the swamp, that didn't work. I have a battery, but Jackson has a battery on the west bank that's shooting across, so he's caught in a crossfire. So he grabs who I consider as the great hero, Colonel Thornton, William Thornton, and he says, Thornton, this is what I want you to do. I want you to cross the river at night, position yourself, and move forward. And I want you to hit that battery before daylight. In the meantime, I'm going to organize the attack on the east bank. I'm going to have Renee, come over here, Renee. I want you to go upriver between the river and the levee. The water's down. The Americans can't shoot you because you're protected by the levee. Don't worry about Patterson's battery. Thornton would have nullified it. So you'll have the protection to go up along the river and capture that forward redoubt on Jackson's line. Now Thornton, if you get those guns and they're not spiked, by all means turn them against Jackson. Gibbs, you advance along the edge on this side, to my right, along the edge of the swamp, and that would be the main thrust. There's a weak point in Jackson's line, we've noticed that. You take that position and you go there. 44th, Colonel Mullins, you come up here. We've made ladders and fastenings, because if you go to the Chalmette battlefield, it's sad, because what you have is a little pile of mud with a couple of cannons behind it. It wouldn't even be a speed bump in reality. This fortification was significant. If you go inside the museum, they have a small diorama, I think, which really lays out what the defenses were. It was about 8-9 feet wide, 4 feet deep of water, and about a 6-foot embankment, 20 feet wide. This is a significant obstacle. So the idea was to have the 44th as a storming party, throwing fascines into the canal to fill it, drop boarding ladders over the top, and then step out the way and allow the British to go over the top. In the meantime, he tells Keane, you go along the side, this side of the levee, and if it looks like Rene's taking it, by all means reinforcing. But if not, be prepared to help Gibbs. We're all set. He thinks. Things start going awry. What happens is, it's left to Cochrane to get the boats into the river. Rather than dragging him and throwing him in, as the British have been dragging the cannons, his determination is to build a canal out all the way to the river, float the boats in, build a dam in the back, then load the men on it, break the levee, the water flows in, the boats flow up, they row out and go across. Pakenham's not too keen on this idea, but it's Cochrane's game, so he lets him have it. He goes to sleep. He wakes up probably about 12, 1 o'clock, and who does he run into? Thornton. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be on the other side of the river. Well, maybe you ought to come take a look at this. When he gets down there, everything worked partially according to plan. They dug the canal out, they floated the boats in, they built a dam in the back, they blew the levee, the water flowed in, the boats floated up, the dam in the back collapsed, the water flowed out, the boats sunk down in the mud. They weren't going anywhere. Thornton was supposed to have 1,400 men. Pakenham then tells him, how many can we get? 600. 600 men are only men that they can use that'll fit into the boats they can drag over the levee and get into the water. So they do. Remember, it's a heavy fog. And I'm going to give you a lead in here. I'm going to break the mystery. But for a piece of wood, where does that come in? The idea was to cross the river, still hoping there's enough time, and get upstream and attack Patterson's battery, and that's the signal for the operation on East Bank to take place. Keane looks at Pakenham and says, perhaps we should wait a day, nothing's going to change. Pakenham essentially says, enough with delays. I'm tired, the morale's down, everybody's hungry, we're miserable, we're going to go forward. At that point, Thornton pushes off and heads across the river. Of course, if you're familiar with the river in the fog, you don't get about 3 or 4 feet and you can't see anybody. Nobody bothered to take a piece of wood and throw it in the river and see if there's a current. There was. So as they push off and Pakenham turns his back on the river, assuming Thornton's going here, Thornton's going here. He's fighting desperately against the current, trying to get across the river. In the meantime, Pakenham has lined all of his men up. He's ready for the assault. He's just waiting for the sound of the guns on the other side of the river. And he's waiting for the sound of the guns on the other side of the river. In the meantime, it's getting later. The sun's starting to come up. The fog's starting to lift. And in the American lines, at Spott's battery, he looks up and says, looky here, it looks like a bunch of British soldiers all lined up. So he fires off his cannon into the British lines. That's the signal. Once it's on, Pakenham then fires 2 Congreve rockets, which is the opening of the attack. When that opening volleys are fired, Thornton has just arrived on the other side of the river, 1.5 miles below the spot he was supposed to land on. He's still got to work his way all the way up. The battle unfolds. Now Rene is coming up along the river, but he's getting hammered by Patterson's battery because Patterson's battery is still there. He takes the forward redoubt, as he's commanded to do, raises his sword and says, the day is ours when Beale's riflemen put about 3 bullets in him and the rest of the officers and retake the redoubt. Gibbs, to the west, has figured, well, I got the easiest side, to the north, I got the easiest thing, because I got this weak side in the line. The problem was, within 2 days, 48 hours before, 2,500 Tennesseans and Kentuckians showed up, and Jackson put them in the weak part of his line in ranks of 4. So you'd shoot, step back, shoot, step back. The British would refer to this as rolling thunder. He's facing this fusillade of ammunition coming at him, and then he can't find the 44th with the ladders and fascines. He's furious. As he says, if I find Mullins, I'll hang him from the highest tree I can find in the swamp. Mullins is a young officer, probably daddy bought the position. When he's giving the orders to do it, he turns to one of his lieutenants and says, we've been ordered to death. Because they're going to be charging the American lines, holding ladders on top of their heads, or holding fascines on top of their heads. We're going to get slaughtered here. Everything was placed in a forward redoubt. Well, there were 2 forward redoubts. He walked past the one in the dock where everything was stored, went to the second one, there was nothing there. So I guess he said, oh, well, I guess they don't have them here, and didn't bother looking for them. So as a result, when Gibbs goes forward, the 44th isn't there with the necessary equipment to break Jackson's line. They get a withering attack, so they have to pull back behind a bend in the woods. It's at this point when Gibbs is furious that he signals to Pakenham. Pakenham rides forward to find the 44th. He finds elements of it, gets them to get the supplies, try to come forward. That's when Pakenham is killed. In the second assault, which is broken as well, that's when Gibbs is killed. Keane is crossing the battlefield. He's not getting anywhere with Rene. Rene's lost it. He's crossing diagonally across the battlefield, and he is seriously wounded. It seems, according to the records, as one British officer said, he got on his horse at the Jumerville plantation, which was a hospital, rode to the front at a quick pace, and by the time he got close to the front, it was over with. Somewhere around the neighborhood of 45 minutes, some say less, the main assault was broken. The British were now in full retreat and rolling back. It's lost. But the British, Thornton, still in the West Bank. The Louisiana, Jackson has taken the guns off to Louisiana to reinforce Patterson's batteries. He has no naval assets in the river other than the Louisiana, which is used to store black powder. It's tied up next to Patterson's battery. The British control the Mississippi River. It might be just barges, but they control the Mississippi River. Thornton comes up, and Jackson, if you can imagine this, is in absolute elation as he sees what's unfolded him. Then he hears pop, 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 shooting in cannons on the West Bank. He looks across to see the American lines breaking and running, setting up a line, being attacked, breaking and running, setting up a line, being attacked, breaking and running. That's what he feared most. A lot of it is his fault. Without getting into too much detail, he sent unqualified men who were exhausted without proper arms on the other side. He expected a full thrust. I don't think he expected the level of Thornton's aggression. Only 600 men he pulls this off. Thornton takes the battery. Now Patterson and Leven spikes the gun, so the cannons aren't available to him, but he spikes the battery, he takes the battery. He looks across the river and he sees the chaos that's taken place. But Thornton pushes forward, and the Americans keep falling back until they get to the very last line of their defense, which is Beaujolais. Jackson, at this point, if you read his account, Patterson's account, and Arsène de la Tour, who was an engineer's account after the battle, they're convinced the Battle of New Orleans is lost because they know that if the British get Algiers Point, they can bring cannons unmolested across, Congreve rockets across, and attack the French Quarter, which is, New Orleans is the capital. You have a split legislature. There were elements, Creole elements in the legislature that didn't want to fight anyway, kind of like France in 1944. So they didn't want to lose the city. They were afraid Jackson might burn it. So as a result, the threat of Thornton there had Jackson exceedingly nervous and upset because he couldn't do anything to stop it. What? Could he leave the men in Chalmette and go to the city of New Orleans? Because if he did that, there were still sufficient British forces to overrun that position if he was not there. If he stayed where he was, would the city fall and the legislature sue for peace? Would his own lines dissolve? Because these were their homes, their families, their businesses in the city. He was in a crisis situation. Thornton gets wounded. He tells his men to stop right before the last line. They're exhausted. They've been rowing all night. They've been fighting all day. He tells them to rest. He crosses across, and he goes up to see Pakenham. I need reinforcements. He asks for Pakenham. He's dead. All right, Gibbs, he's dead. Rene, he's dead. Wilkinson, he's dead. Keane, he might as well be dead. He's in a pretty bad way. One person left is Lambert. Lambert's in charge of the reserves. Lambert is overwhelmed by what he's seen. Thornton asks him for reinforcements. He doesn't know what to do. He sends an artillery commander named Wilkinson to the other side. Wilkinson comes back and tells him, oh, it'll take all sorts of ammunition, Congreve rockets, and about 2,000 men. We have no record of what Thornton's reaction to that was, but it was likely, I went this far with 600. But even so, if I need 2,000, we have the river, we have the men. We came here with nearly 14,000 men. We haven't lost that many. So while this debate's going on, and Jackson's concerned, unbelievably, he suddenly hears a bugle blow. And on his side of the river, when he looks down the river, he sees 3 British officers. one with a white flag, one with a bugle, one standing there. So he sends one of his men down to find out what it's about. The guy comes back with a letter, opens it up, he said, I'd like to talk terms.
A little bit louder, please.
Okay, I'd like to talk terms. Lambert. Jackson folds it up, gives it back. I don't know any damn Lamberts. Goes down, comes back up. General of the British Army, Lambert. We killed all the officers. I'll meet with him. So he meets with him. And Lambert says, listen, I'd like to put a line up about 300 yards forward of your position. If you could take the dead, bring them to that line, and let the ambulatory wards accounts. They cannot believe that Lambert is pulling them off the railroad. They have the Battle of New Orleans. They've won this thing if they press the advantage. He withdraws the troops, pulls off. Jackson immediately reinforces the West Bank and brings a battery down opposite the Villeray Plantation so he can hammer the British while they're in their tents. Everything's quiet until the 18th of January. At that point, it's too quiet. Jackson's looking at the lines. He sees British sentries set up. And Humbert, who was a French artillery officer who fought with Napoleon, takes his telescope out, looks, and tells Jackson, they're gone. Jackson says, no, they're lined up there. He says, no, they're not. Look over their head. They got crows flying. Crows don't fly over people. They're gone. He sends a scouting mission down there and finds that the British have taken marsh grass, sugar cane, stuffed the uniforms of the soldiers, dead soldiers, propped them up as if they were sentries, and taken advantage of this cover to withdraw and leave. You think it's over with, but it's not. They go to Dauphin Island, they refresh themselves, they bring the fleet there, and then all of a sudden the Americans come over and they're meeting. Livingston, the rest, we're talking exchanges of prisoners, what are we going to do with slavery, you know, the negotiations you have after a battle, at which point Cochrane says, oh, by the way, you might be interested in something, and he draws the curtains behind him on the ship, the Tunnet, and there you see the American flag coming down on Fort Boyer and the British flag going up. He's just taken Fort Boyer. And there's some speculation that he's prepared to go to the full port press like he began in September and do it again. Only at this time, I believe it's the next morning, Sam, if I'm not mistaken, a launch arrives, a British officer gets off, hands the tube to Cochrane, he opens it up, and that's proof that the Treaty of Peace has now been taken care of, ratified, the war is over, they break out wine, they sit down together and celebrate the fact that they're at peace. And from that moment on, British soldiers and American soldiers will never cross themselves in battle again. We've been allies ever since. So that, in essence, is the Battle of New Orleans. It wasn't one battle. It was a campaign. And the entire future development, Western expansion of the United States, hung in the balance. And we almost lost it on more than one occasion. So you can't be smug about, oh, we beat the Brits. They kind of beat themselves. Thank you.
Thank you.